Hello, and welcome to the first ever Cutting Edge podcast. I'm Reen. I've done some voiceovers for Cutting Edge in the past, and now I'm sitting here with Gavin Salkeld, who is the creator, the writer, the composer, the director of Cutting Edge. We are going to be talking about some censorship things that we cannot cover in the video series. We're going to ask some questions. We have some questions from some viewers. And we're just going to really talk about some interesting things.
Hopefully interesting.
Yeah, hopefully. I would think so.
I hope that anyone who's listening to this has a good time.
Okay, well, I guess the first and most important question would be, how did you personally get into censorship?
Well, it's hard to pinpoint a specific thing. I guess when I was younger, 8 or 9 perhaps, you would watch a movie on the TV that you already owned, and you would instantly know if something was missing. So I remember watching Indiana Jones. I want to say it was the Temple of Doom, but I can't remember, which is a film that we did on the actual show. I might be wrong, but there's a scene in one of those films anyway where they have to walk through like a pit, and it's full of spiders and centipedes, huge centipedes and all that kind of stuff. It's really gross for kids. And there's a specific shot where there's a female with her back towards us and all the bugs are crawling up her back. And I remember clearly seeing that in the uncut version, and then watching it on the television. That was not in the film because it was on early in the afternoon. So I guess that's when I became aware that there were different versions of films, even though I didn't necessarily understand the reasons why or who was responsible. And then I kind of never really thought about it for a while. And then I was about 15 or 16 and saw Cliffhanger on BBC One, and I hadn't seen it in a long time. I think the first version I originally watched was a heavily cut version that we got on a video that someone had recorded off Sky. But I watched it on BBC One, and I think within a week I went to a store to buy the VHS, and there was stuff missing from the VHS that had been on the television version, and that made me think, well, that's a bit odd. I mean, I watched it on BBC One. If there was anything going to be missing from the film, it would be missing from the TV, not from the version I bought in a store, surely. And then not long after that, I came across the Melon Farms website, which hosts our series. And I remember the day clearly. There was this big, huge A through Z of all these films and everything that was missing from them. And I was amazed that these were videos that we were buying in a store that somebody had said had bits in we weren't allowed to watch. And when you start to recognize films that you know and love, and then you realize after years of watching these that there were bits that you haven't been allowed to see, I spent pretty much that whole weekend, I went through the entire A to Z, looking up all these films that I knew and loved and realized how much was missing from them. I guess that's when I really got into censorship and realized how far-reaching it was. It wasn't just films on the television that were cut. It was stuff you could buy in the stores.
I do hate the thought of somebody in a suit telling me what I can and cannot see.
And I just remember thinking, this is appalling. I want to see these. Why am I not allowed to see these? Why am I spending money on a cut version of a film?
Right.
I guess that's what, and then I began to realize you could get uncut versions from the USA or from other countries, and it was like, I got a lot of videos I have to rebuy. And that's what I did. I spent a lot of money. I got the widescreen NTSC VHS of The Rock from the United States, ordered it from Barnes & Noble before I knew what Barnes & Noble was. I remember the day that came in the mail. That was a glorious day because it had all the violence that had been in the UK cinema version with a 15, and it was a 15 on the VHS, and I think it was missing like 15 seconds of violence. But it made a world of difference.
It does, because sometimes when they cut things, it does hinder the story. Like,
right.
Something doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Or when the music gets jumpy, it makes the composer look like he doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah.
And you as a composer would know how horrible that would be to have your music cut up.
Right, yeah. I mean, you can't help but notice things. There's some really bad ones in Die Hard with a Vengeance, another film we looked at. It's uncut now, but when it was originally on VHS, it was... And I can remember coming home from HMV with the video which was the full screen version as well. This was before I knew about widescreen. It was the full screen one, and I remember saying, because I'd watched it on ITV, and I remember I said, now I've got the uncut version. Because I thought that films were only cut on television. This was before I found out about the Melon Farmer site. I remember thinking, now we've got the uncut version. And it wasn't not long after that I discovered that a lot of stuff was missing from that film as well. And it was just appalling to think that, you know...
Now, you say that it's uncut now.
Yes.
So do you think that the world, the BBFC and maybe the MPAA are more lenient now than they were back then?
Absolutely. I mean, as a rather naive 15-year-old, I used to hate the BBFC. I used to think they were a bunch of idiots. But as I've gotten older, not only have they moved with the times, which I think anybody like them has to, when you think about what used to be cut from films like 50 years ago, is now rated PG or 12A in some cases. Yes, I think they have become more lenient.
Do you think it's the same with the MPAA, or do you think they're not moving as quickly? Because you live in America now, so you can...
I don't see any indication that the MPAA have moved on much in the past, 20 years? I think that might be fair to say.
But you don't cover a lot of the MPAA stuff. Like, you really do focus on the BBFC. Is that because you're from England and you just...
Yes, I used to email them on a regular basis. This was probably nearly 20 years ago.
And then you got banned.
And then I actually got an email from them to say, stop contacting us. You're contacting us too much. But I just had a lot of questions. So I guess it's a lot easier for me to look at films that were cut by the BBFC because I have all these lists from years ago that I've added to over the years as well from other friends and from other sources.
And that was just because you had a personal interest.
Right, yeah. The MPAA are notoriously very secretive. There's a film called This Film Is Not Yet Rated, which if you haven't watched that, I would strongly recommend it. It's a documentary about the MPAA. And I don't think they've moved on at all, really. But yeah, it's much harder to look at MPAA cuts because they just don't release anything. They don't give you a list of what they've removed and why. It's very hard to get anything out of them, if at all. So with films that were cut by the MPAA, you just have to watch the cut version and the uncut version and make a note of the differences.
Have you ever tried contacting them, and have they just ignored you, or...?
Once I think it was when the Da Vinci Code was just being released, and I think I emailed them to ask about if the edits that had been made by the BBFC in the UK had been applied to the version of the film that was being released in the USA. Never got a reply.
Seems a bit rude, doesn't it?
Not even an automated one. Nothing. So nothing. Well, I think I've tried once or twice not long after that, but I wasn't getting anywhere with them.
You seem to focus more on action films than anything else. Is there a particular reason for that, or is it just because it's so common, but yet so many people don't seem to know it? Yeah,
that was the main reason, was that as you ask anybody randomly and they'll go, oh yeah, horror movies get cut, but not a lot of people know, at least in Britain in the 80s and the 90s, that a great many action films were also edited. It's not a thing that I guess most are aware of. So I kind of wanted to, and there's a lot of videos online that look at horror films and the edits that were made to things like the video nasties. And I didn't want to do that because everybody kind of already knows. And I didn't see anybody really that was covering action movies, which I love. So, I mean, I have done some horror films. We've done Hellraiser films and a handful of others, but I wanted to do action films more because not a lot of people were aware that some of these action films were edited.
Right, so that seems unfair to the viewer.
Right, because you go to action films, I guess one reason you go to horror films is because you want to see the gore and the violence. That's more or less why I think people want to watch action films. They want to see the hero dealing out some damage. And
that's what I want to see.
Right.
I want to see John McClane riddling people with bullets.
Right.
Or Rambo destroying the bad guys.
Right, and when you don't, you're not really getting what you paid for.
Right, and it's unsatisfying.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've been ripped off.
Yeah. At least that's how I did when I spent £15 on a cut version of a video when I had no money. So, yes, it is fair to say that we've looked at action films more. It won't always be like that with Cutting Edge. We will be looking at some other films, like we've just done one on Language, The Angels Share. We won't just be focusing on action or horror films because it gets rather samey if you just keep looking at the same kind of films.
Right. What about like TV? Like, because I know that's what I like to see the differences in TV versions. Now, I know that each like network has their own rules or something. Have you ever thought about focusing on or touching base on like, you know, a common station that would play movies like TBS?
Right.
Like how they go about it? Ever think about anything like that?
Yes, it is a thing I'd like to do, I think. Would be interesting because often, as you say, every network has their own rules. So you get everything from swearing will be muted, which is dreadful. You'll be watching a film and the sound will go off if someone says fuck, which is highly condescending, I think. I don't know how that's acceptable to anybody. Then you get films that use different footage that's not in the uncut version. So an example of that would be The Rock, which I believe they used specially shot stuff from the airline version of the film, which is not in any other version you can buy. So it would be, there is some merit to looking at TV versions. It's just sometimes hard to get a hold of the material in a good enough quality. We've had that issue with the episode we did on The Rock. The Australian VHS used some of the airline footage version in their VHS that was cut. It would be really good to look at some other instances like that. Scream is another film I can think of. They used specially recorded lines by the cast that were different in order to hide the bad language. And again, if you're not looking for that, you're probably not going to notice it. So it's always fascinating when you watch a TV version of a film here in the US that you know and love, and you hear these newly recorded lines that you've never heard before, and you can't buy them anywhere. It's not on the DVD version. So, yeah, that is a thing I think we'll be looking at, as long as we can get a hold of the materials. Yeah, that would be something I'd like to do.
I suppose would be the hard part.
Yeah.
Also, it'd be interesting to maybe like contact the network and just hope for a response to how they figure out what they've deemed necessary. Because they all have their own rules, so you can watch one thing that has a muted dialogue, go to a next station playing the same movie, and it has dubbed dialogue. Right.
You watched True Lies once on one network and another one, and they were completely different versions of the same film, right?
Well, they wouldn't stop playing True Lies. It was playing over and over again, and I'd never seen it, and I absolutely fell in love with that movie because it is now absolutely one of my favorite films. And I remember that one of them was muted, and there was one when she's doing the striptease where they were completely fine showing her thonged ass, which is a very nice thonged ass.
Agreed.
They were fine showing that. But then on the next station, because I watched it again the next night on a different station, they had a big black dot over her butt. And it couldn't follow it correctly.
It's pathetic.
So she's, writhing against the bedpost, and the black dot is moving, trying to cover it.
Understand? That's
I've never seen a butt before.
That might be worse than the muted swearing. I mean, to put a black spot over something.
And she was wearing underwear.
Right, and even if she was, it's just a butt. We've all got them.
Right, we all have butts.
I think that's one of the worst ever cases of censorship. I wish I'd seen it because that's dreadful. I mean, how is that? That's so condescending to anyone watching it.
I would have loved to been able to capture the footage, but I am not technologically savvy, so that's a fail for Cutting Edge right there. I think we could go now to some questions from your fans and viewers.
Okay, shoot, yeah, absolutely.
Because we do have a few. We're just going to we can't cover them all, but we will cover a few. Let's go to our first question here from Kieran Thomas. I love your show and its content, but I was wondering if you had plans to make a Cutting Edge episode on the Death Wish films because of their history with the BBFC and MPAA. I don't know what the Death Wish films are, so...
Thanks for watching the show, first of all. It has been on our list of films to look at for a while, since season 1, I think. We hope that we will be able to look at those films. We just don't know when. Unfortunately, I can't be more specific than that, I'm afraid. But thanks for your question.
The second question on my list here from Richard Weston. What's the one film you have done a video about which you wished wasn't cut? I think that's a good question.
That's a very good question. Okay, well, I guess that would probably be Cliffhanger, one of my all-time favourite action films. purely because I've spent money on so many different versions, which my mother will attest to. I've spent money on so many different versions of that film from different countries on different formats over the years that if it had been uncut originally, then I wouldn't have had to spend all that money.
That actually ties in with the question I was going to ask you. It might be a hard question to answer.
I'll try.
But what do you think in all the films that you've studied the censorship about? Mm-hmm. What do you think is the most ridiculous cut you've seen yet?
I would have to say, well, my mind immediately goes to a cut in Lethal Weapon 4, where, for whatever reason, whether it was the filmmakers or whether it was James Furman, he didn't specifically list this as being a thing they had to take out, so I'm going to assume it was Warner Brothers, but I don't know why they would do it because I can't see anything wrong with it. There's a scene where Rene Russo's character lifts her elbow in the air. And that was cut. It's right before she hits a guy in the face with her elbow. And it's a very brief shot of her lifting her elbow in the air. I always thought that was ridiculous. Now, the guy's holding a knife at the time, but A, from memory, I don't think you can really see it. And B, I think her lifting the elbow up before she hits him is worse in a way, because she hits him just before that. I think she kicks him or something. So with them removing her, lifting her elbow up, it now looks like she hits him really rapidly in quick succession. That's the first thing I can think of that's been a ridiculous thing, is her lifting her elbow in the air.
That does seem like a stupid thing to cut.
I mean, it's not even threatening. It's just ridiculous. I've always thought that was insane.
Okay, fair enough. Here's one that ties in with the Angel's Share from Mikey Halton. Mikey asks, according to the BBFC, their guidelines are based on public consultation. Does the British public really care how cunt is used, whether it's comic tone, aggressive tone, or followed by a violent act? The word is like Marmite. You either hate it or you don't.
Right, that's true. It's not as big as a concern as it was when the Angel's Share was out in 2012. They did a consultation in 2014. And the overall feedback was that the BBFC should be more lenient at the 15 level with that word. So if the Angel's Share had just been released a few years later, it probably wouldn't have been edited as much, or if at all. So yes, I think it is a fact that there are... I see no reason for them to lie about their guidelines being based on public consultation, because they are, and it happens regularly. You can actually go onto the BBFC's website and read their notes on this research that they did in 2014. It's written up there for all to see.
Fair enough. Okay. So I think we have about time for one more question here. Ben Davies, he asks, which area do you think the BBFC are A, too strict, and B, too lenient? Another good question, because I would have liked to ask that myself.
It's a hard one, really. I think on the whole, I mean, I would never have said this when you asked me when I was 15 years old, but I think on the whole, they get it right. I think they're very fair. Obviously, everybody's not going to agree with them on everything. I think they're probably too strict regarding the use of the word cunt at 15. Although they have become a little bit more lenient, as we said, since 2014. I think probably by that age you've heard it all. I don't think you can really put a limit on the word cunt in a 15 unless it was used in something like a rape scene or something like that. So if you had a man hitting a woman, you know, like called her a fucking horrible little cunt or something, I can understand that not being really suitable for 15-year-olds. But right. I think if it's just in general speaking, naturalistic settings, I don't think you can really put a limit. I don't think the Angel's Share should be an 18 in its uncut version. That seems ridiculous.
Right.
So I think they're probably too strict on the word cunt, although weirdly I do think there should be some kind of a limit, but only on how it's used. I think, as I mentioned, if it's in a rape scene, I think it's worse if it's used towards a woman by a man than it would be like a couple of mates going, "Oh, you silly little cunt." I don't think you can really... I think that's probably where they're too strict. That's the only thing I can probably think of. I think the rest of the time they get it pretty much right. I don't think they're too lenient with anything, really. Although I've seen a couple of films that were 15s that had pretty strong levels of violence in them. but it wasn't so horrifying that I felt compelled to send them an email to say, what are you playing at?
What about the MPAA? Do you think they're too strict or too lenient on anything?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'd say they're probably too strict on language. At the PG-13 level, if you have a film that uses the word fuck more than twice, let's say, you're pretty much going to get an R, which I think is ridiculous. I think it would make more sense if it was, say, like 3 or 4 uses, as long as they weren't angrily used or in like a sexual way, which I think is a rule anyway. I don't think on the whole you're allowed to use the word fuck in a sexual way in a PG-13. However, my best friend's wedding was originally granted an R because of the way they used the word fuck in one scene. It was used to mean have sex with. So I don't know what the exact line was, but somebody said something like blah, 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 and he's going to fuck me, or something like that. You're not allowed to use it in that way. You automatically get an R, even if it's just used once. However, the filmmakers said this is mental, and they got the rating lower to a PG-13. That line was actually cut for the UK version to get a 12 rating. So I think that the MPAA are probably too strict on the F word at PG-13, probably. I think they're too lenient with violence. Well, again, that's an American thing. I hate to say it. It seems to me that violence is fine. Sex, no. I've seen some pretty violent PG-13s. It's usually action films where you go, God, you've really pushed the limit there. Mm-hmm. And normally those films are 15s in England, which I think is fair. Like Live Free or Die Hard is a 15 in England. I think that's probably, even though it's a milder 15, I think that is a better rating than a PG-13. That's a pretty violent. I know there's not a lot of like gore or blood, at least in the regular version. It's just there's a lot of violence.
Okay, I think that's about all we have time for. We would like to thank you guys for listening, and thank you for watching the Cutting Edge series. So you guys keep the questions coming in, and we will talk to you guys next time. Thank you.